Good evening, everyone. If you could please take your seats as soon as you could. Um, I know everyone is trying to settle in, and we have such a huge crowd. This is really impressive. Um, so I'm going to start, at least with the intro, even though there's a few people still getting their beverages. So good evening. As always, I welcome our members and some prospective members to the first lecture of our new season, the 23rd season. I'm Deanna Conheeney, president of this great organization. It's so nice to be together again in person after the summer and via Zoom. We have many people at home. We had glorious summer, but the last few days certainly topped some of those days off. And we have a busy year ahead of us, the museum, starting with tonight's lecture. Then on September 30th, we have our fall fundraiser with the Irish storyteller and singer Helena Byrne. This will be a fun evening with stories of Irish fairies and ghosts, family stories, and folk songs. Next, we have 2 Bonnie Street cemetery tours scheduled with our own renowned historian entertainer, Steve Marino, on October 6th and October 20th. Our lecture series then continues with a collaborative lecture with Touro Synagogue Foundation on October 28th, The Unlikely Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews in America. And then on November 20th, Dr. Marion Matheson DeRocha, which is, I believe is here, will present a Celtic team in Newport. Please check out all these happenings on the website under the events tab. And of course, the Interpretive Center is open through Columbus Day. Please visit us, open Thursday through Sunday, noon to 5. I challenge you, as I have in many other times, to come in and help identify some of the people in our photos. As you know, through your support and the grants we've received, we are moving into the digital age. Mike Slane is busy converting our 3 walking tours of Irish Newport to a downloadable cell phone app, and then we will be engaging a consultant to design, create a digital display in the museum, enhancing the stories of Irish immigration in Newport County. Also, the Luck of the Irish raffle will return this year, and more to come on that in November. I always want to thank the board of directors for all their efforts. They're extremely involved in the energy and success of the museum, and each one of them is a major contributor. And I always like to ask the board if you could stand up, those that are here, so that you can acknowledge all the great work they do. I know we have a few. Please. Thank you very, very much. Okay. And now to the main event. I want to thank Ginny Pitsley for once again being so generous to sponsor this lecture. It is in memory of her husband, Bill Pitsley, and their son, Jay. Ginny is such a true friend of the museum. Our lecture tonight is no stranger to us, Dr. John Quinn. This is his 11th lecture for the museum. Dr. Quinn is a professor at Salve Regina University, specializing in Irish history and American ethnic and religious history. Hopefully you notice as you arrive that Dr. Quinn's new book, The Rise of Newport's Catholics, From Colonial Outcasts to Gilded Age Leaders, is available in the back for purchase. Please check it out after the lecture if you didn't get a chance upon arriving. So 2 men of Irish descent will be the center of John's presentation. Dr. Philip Grace, pastor of St. Mary's, and James Gordon Bennett Jr., publisher of the New York Herald. This will be a unique look at 2 prominent people that were not the Vanderbilts or the Astors, but were from the large Irish population in Newport during the Gilded Age. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Quinn as he presents Dr. Grace and Mr. Pruitt.
Thanks, Deanna, for those kind words. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. If that changes, let me know. Well, nice to be here and nice to see so many friendly faces. I feel like it's old home week here, so I'm seeing so many folks. You know, the book that Deanna mentioned, I think was about 10 years in coming. So a lot of people helped me with it. I just want to take a minute to thank a few folks from the museum. And so we said 11 lectures. Well, some of these lectures, I need to thank Deanna's predecessor, Mike Slane, for always encouraging me and welcoming my ideas for talks. And of course, Ann Arnold for all of her behind the scenes work to make everything come off smoothly. And of course, Ginny Pitsley for her generous support for me and for others. And then on the research side, I'd say I want to thank Steve Marino, the museum's historian. Periodically, Steve would send me these little emails saying, have you seen this? He would pull things out of the file cabinets over at the Interpretive Center, and usually I hadn't, and usually it was quite interesting. Father Bob Heyman, who's spoken here a few times, he's the archivist in the diocese, and he was very helpful to me whenever I went up there. Kurt Schlichting for helping me with stats. I never was great in stats, and so he did a lot of number crunching for me to help me, so I appreciate that. Dan Titus for all his tech help, and also, people may not know, Dan has a great postcard collection of Newport postcards. So the cover, this is a Dan Titus postcard from, we think, 1910, I think. So and inside, if you look at the book, you'll see a number of books with credits to Dan's collection. So that was, I really appreciate Dan's help. And then I want to thank, too, the city historian, the longtime city historian, Pat Murphy. Pat helped me on a number of occasions. I'd have some obscure question, and he would answer me right away. And I don't know if people know this, but Pat indexed the Newport Daily News from 1860 to 1999. It's just a Herculean task, just to think about that. And he gave it to me. He let me have the index. So as a researcher, that's just amazing how helpful that was. So with all these, I was thinking about that, all these different folks in the museum, if I didn't have all that help, I'm not sure the book would ever see the light of day. So I'm going to be giving a few talks, and so I'm happy that my first talk is here. That just sort of seems appropriate. So anyway, well, I chose this topic because I think this is an important era in Newport's history. And it seems to me that most historians focus on the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the parties that they have, and you know, the Mother Goose Ball and the White Ball and who got invited and, you know, who were in the 400, which is great. And I agree, people like Alva Vanderbilt are quite interesting and deserve some attention. But somehow historians have passed over the Irish. I mean, if you read a history of Gilded Age Newport, you'll be hard pressed to find anything about the Irish in it. By my estimates, I think Newport was about 40% Irish during the Gilded Age. So that would be Irish born or second generation. So maybe even higher. That might be a conservative estimate. An Irish American held the mayor's office for 17 years. We've had a talk on that by Steve Marino. That's Patrick Boyle. The Irish held many important positions in town. City Council, Public School Committee, Board of Aldermen, you name it, they were everywhere. So one of my goals with the book is to write the Irish back into Newport's story, but particularly in the Gilded Age, because they've gotten dropped out for whatever reason. And so for the presentation, I decided to focus on two leading Irish figures, Dr. Philip Grace, longtime pastor of St. Mary's. He served for 29 years, which almost makes him the longest serving pastor in St. Mary's. People at St. Mary's probably know someone's got him beat out, right? Okay, yes, right? So he's the second longest serving pastor. And then James Gordon Bennett, the flamboyant publisher of the New York Herald, two very different men, but their paths crossed in Newport from time to time, and both of Irish descent. So first, Gilded Age, it was usually dated from the end of the Civil War to World War I. That's sort of the rough dates. Mostly I'm going to talk about the 1870s and 80s tonight, but I'm going to back up a little bit to 1855. I think that's a good sort of starting point to get us ready for that. In that year, 1855, Father James Fitton stepped down as pastor of St. Mary's and was transferred to a parish in the Boston area in East Cambridge. Fitton had been in Newport for 11 years and had accomplished a number of things. When he arrived in Newport, Catholics had a small wooden church on Barney Street. Fitton was underwhelmed by the church when he saw it. You know, it was small. It was on this little back street, Barney Street. Here's Father Fitton. So it wasn't centrally located. It's made of wood. It's not made of stone. But his main concern was safety. he was afraid that this new church, which was called St. Joseph's, which was only 7 years old, wasn't sturdy enough. And there had been a couple of real terrible tragedies in the prior 10 years. There was a Catholic church in New Haven that opened in the 1830s. And on opening day, the church, of course, was full of people, and the gallery collapsed. And there were all these people up in the gallery. And so people died in the opening of the church. It was just horrible. And that similar thing happened in Boston. And so he was probably on alert about that. And so that's his first priority. He wants to change that church. Well, he has the help of a wealthy mother-daughter combination, Catherine Harper and her daughter, Emily. And through their help, he was able to hire a prominent, prestigious Irish architect named Patrick Keeley to design a new Gothic church in a much more central location, right, from Barney Street, right, and to make it out of stone, not out of wood, right? Here's Emily Harper. So that's the daughter. I don't have any pictures of the mother, Catherine Harper, but Catherine Harper was the daughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Now, you know when you have in your name of something, you're doing pretty well, right? When I become John Quinn of Portsmouth, you know, I'll really feel like I've made it, right? So that's him. So he was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. There were 55 signers. He's the only Catholic. He was also the richest of the 55. And then also, interesting enough, he was the last survivor. I don't know if people know the story about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, that they both lived 50 years after the signing of the Declaration, and they died on July 4th, 1826. Well, he outlived them. He lived to be 95, lived into the 1830s. So they used to refer to him as the signer because he was the last living signer. So the Harpers are coming to Newport, vacationing. They've got a lot of money, a lot of resources, right? Mrs. Harper, by the way, had built a house on Bellevue Avenue. She was one of the first people to build on Bellevue in the 1830s, because Bellevue Avenue is still not really developed. You know, you think of where the center of town would have been more towards, think of like where the Viking Hotel is. Her place was on Narragansett and Bellevue at that traffic light. If people can all think of that man seated diagonally across the street would be the Harper Mansion, which is no longer. It's got condos or something there, but a beautiful house she had. So she's very interested in helping Father Fitton make this dream come true. So she gives him the money to buy the land, this estate on Spring Street that he's going to get. And then she gives him money to buy materials. So she's really key, the mother and the daughter. And then there's other people too. There's Lieutenant Rosecrans over at Fort Adams is going to play a key role in helping to build that church. And so in 1852, the church is able to open. The Daily News is thrilled. They call it an ornament to the city, right? This beautiful new church centrally located. And now called St. Mary's, not St. Joseph's, right? Well, soon after opening the new church and closing the Barney Street Chapel, Fitton invited the Sisters of Mercy to come to Newport and teach in the school. Let me see. Oh, this is Patrick Keeley. He was a very prestigious architect. He really designed many of the cathedrals in New England, Saints Peter and Paul in Providence. That's a Keeley. So Fitton, after he gets the church open, he invites the Sisters of Mercy to come. He gets in touch with Mother Frances Xavier Ward, American head of the order. She sails down from Providence in 1854 with 4 Mercy sisters. She sets them up in a convent near the church and then gets back on the boat and goes home back to Providence. This is her. She looks like a formidable figure, I think, right? Wouldn't you say? You're not going to mess with Mother Xavier. Well, so by 1855, Father Fitton's done a lot of things, but he's not finished. And I mean, he really was abruptly recalled. So the church was open since 1852, but it wasn't finished. The tower in front wasn't there. There was no organ, no pews inside, and no stained glass on the church. And while he got the sisters to operate the school, there was no schoolhouse for them. So they're just teaching class out of the convent. So imagine what a tight, situation that would have been. So there was a lot of work to be done. Well, the bishop in 1855 was Bernard O'Reilly. He was Irish-born and was serving as the Bishop of Hartford. Now, the diocese was Connecticut and Rhode Island. The Vatican, when they saw the size of Rhode Island on a map, they were like, that's not a diocese, right? So that's got to be attached to some bigger place, right? So it's the Diocese of Hartford. Well, Bishop O'Reilly was of the view that the diocese was desperately poor. He thought that the Hartford diocese was the poorest diocese in the whole United States. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he thought. He said everybody works in the mills and they have no money. So he decided in 1855 he was going to go on what's called a begging trip. He's going to go back to Europe and hopefully raise some money, but also recruit people. So he decides to go to Ireland. He's going to recruit some sisters and maybe brothers to teach in the schools. He goes to France and he goes to Belgium, hoping to raise some funds. So he sets out in 1855 on this begging trip. But before he leaves, he appoints his brother, who was also a priest, as the pastor of St. Mary's to take over and try to finish up what Fitton had started. And he not only appoints him pastor, but he makes him vicar general of the diocese. So this is Bishop O'Reilly, as we said, Irish-born. So the bishop takes off in December 1855, travels, he reaches Europe, he goes to Ireland. There's some letters from his trip. It seemed like he had a successful trip. And then he gets on a steamboat called the Pacific in January 1856 in Liverpool to sail back to New York. Ship was never seen again. Thought to have sunk somewhere in the Atlantic, never recovered. I was reading one account, one researcher thought maybe it had an iceberg. But what's amazing is nothing from the ship was ever recovered. No corpses, nothing, just completely vanished. 185 people on the ship. And there's these sad columns in the Providence Journal where they're saying, again, no sight of any of the people from the Pacific. And then for a while, they thought maybe the bishop wasn't on the ship. And then, and so he kind of goes back and forth for weeks. Church officials finally in May decided to have a funeral for him, even though they never found the body, in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Well, so Father O'Reilly, had been he was called Vicar General of the diocese, and he was sort of acting in for his brother. But the Vatican did not make him the bishop when they had to appoint a new person. They just left him in charge of St. Mary's, and there was a lot to do at St. Mary's, right? So, and so Father O'Reilly is going to get to work finishing what Father Fitton had started. He put a tower in the front of St. Mary's. He purchased an organ. He put pews in. That's nice, right? And he got in touch with Patrick Keeley, the architect, about designing a schoolhouse for the parish. And this was very unusual. I don't think Keeley designed any other schoolhouses. He was usually designing cathedrals, right? So, and he was expensive to hire, but he used excellent materials for the school. And I think even if you think of that building, it's still a beautiful building, right? The former school, I mean, it's still in very good shape. Well, I'm sure that was to the delight of the Mercy Sisters to see that building open in 1867. The school building was set up with classrooms on the first 2 floors, and then the 3rd floor was for parish societies. And the Newport Directory was very impressed with the 3rd floor, and they said it was most beautifully painted and frescoed. So they must have had paintings all over the ceiling. I don't know if people are familiar with Newport Directory. There's these old city directories. They have all kinds of interesting info, they're published each year. So, well, poor Father O'Reilly didn't have much chance to enjoy the new school. He died the following year, 1868, 53 years old. Oops, am I going the wrong way? But here's his school. And I just noticed this cornerstone recently. It's funny how you can go by things forever and not notice it, but this is where they put the cornerstone. Instead of putting it down at the bottom, it's way up, near the roof line. So I'm trying to think this would be the Spring Street side of it, if you were to go up on that side. And now this will be a vision test for everybody. Probably it says erected by the Catholics of Newport, AD 1865. I don't know if you can see that cornerstone. If not, take my word on it. But sometime if you walk on that side, I just happen to see that. So this beautiful building that he put on. But as I say, he didn't have much chance to enjoy it. Well, his successor was just 31 years old. Father Philip Grace, born in County Kilkenny, had come to America as a child, came to Connecticut, and he went to the University of Notre Dame for school. But he left Notre Dame, decided to study for the priesthood, went up to Montreal, and served in different parishes in Connecticut. Before coming to Newport, he was in New London. And when he arrived at St. Mary's, he learned, I don't think he knew this until he actually walked in the door, was that the church was deeply in debt, tens of thousands of dollars in debt, just because of all the expenses that had been incurred in building that beautiful schoolhouse, but also, I think, building the tower for St. Mary's was expensive. So Grace proves to be an adept fundraiser. So here's him. As far as I know, this is the only image I have seen of Father Grace. So he does a great job fundraising. After 3 years, so this would be 1872, the Newport Mercury's editor praised him effusively for his achievements. Although we, of course, hold the Protestant opinions, we are yet capable of appreciating the work of a clergyman of another faith. And therefore, when the Pope, Pius IX, has another bishop to make in this part of his jurisdiction, we respectfully suggest the name of an accomplished scholar, able clergyman, Father Grace. So they're telling the Pope to make him a bishop, right? Newport. As the editor pointed out, Grace was a scholar as well as a fundraiser. In 1875, the Newport Historical Society invited him to give an address at their annual meeting, which they held at the Redwood Library. Father Grace lectured for 2 hours on the papacy's role in the development of Western civilization and thoroughly impressed his listeners. I'm not going to speak as long, anyway, if anyone's worried. It is 2 hours. Goodness. One member of the Historical Society, the Reverend Charles Malcolm, who was a Baptist minister in town, sent a glowing letter to the Boston Pilot, the leading Irish newspaper, really the leading Irish newspaper in the United States, the Boston Pilot. And he pointed out that Grace was the first Catholic to speak before the Historical Society. And while he acknowledged that Grace made a few statements from which he, as a Protestant minister, might dissent, the writer considered Grace's discourse the best one ever delivered before the Historical Society. And they made him an honorary member of the Historical Society. John Lafarge, son of the painter and stained glass artist. Would people be familiar with him, John Lafarge? If you've been to Salve's Chapel, that's John Lafarge, stained glass in front. Well, John Lafarge had 10 children. His youngest was also John Jr. And John Jr. eventually became a Jesuit, actually. Well, so John Jr. recalled that Grace used to preach hour-long sermons with Greek, Latin, and Hebrew references in them. Phew, wow. Well, the local bishop at this time, Thomas Hendricken, was so impressed with Grace's learning that he asked the Pope to award him an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree, Doctor in Theology. Bishop Hendricken notified Grace of his award, and from this point on, 1878 is when this happens, Grace was referred to as Doctor rather than Father. He was given a special ring to wear and a special hat to wear. And I saw a picture of it. I think you call it a tam, but it's the kind of soft hat that some people would wear at a graduation ceremony, a kind of velvety sort of hat. I think he wore that a lot. So, well, meanwhile, another Newporter with Irish roots was gaining considerably more fame than Grace. James Gordon Bennett Jr. was the half-Irish, half-Scottish son of James Gordon Bennett Sr. and his wife, Henrietta Crean. Henrietta was from Ireland. The father was from Scotland. Bennett Sr. had found fame and fortune through the New York Herald, an informative and sometimes sensationalist newspaper that he established. The elder Bennett often took aim at other editors and a host of politicians in his columns. So there's Gordon Bennett Sr., and that's Henrietta, his Irish wife. Well, the elder Bennett's editorials were so harsh and accusatory that his targets would sometimes assault him on the streets if they saw him. They would literally like come up and, pound on him. Henrietta couldn't take it. She wanted no part of the conflict that was constantly swirling around her husband. So she took James Jr. to Paris to raise him in 1850. He would have been about 9 years old. Now, why would you not go back to Ireland in 1850? Famine? Okay, good. Not an option. Well, the parents didn't divorce. Occasionally, Henrietta would sail over to New York to visit her husband, and now and then he'd sail back to France to visit her. But with the parents apart so much, James Jr. received almost no supervision and became a heavy drinker while still in his teens. By the start of the Civil War, so if he's born in 1841, he'd be about 20 then, at the start of the Civil War. The young Bennett decided to return to America and serve in the war, joining the Union Navy. He brought along one of the family's yachts called the Henrietta, named for his mother. Oh, shoot, sorry, am I going? Okay, here we go. So here he is in his naval outfit. So he joins and brings the yacht. I think of that as BYOB, bring your own boat, right? Join the war and bring your own boat. So, so soon after the war's end, he only served for a year or so, the elder Bennett decided to step down from the Herald and make his son the editor and publisher. Just 26 years old, the younger Bennett eagerly took the reins, wanting to continue his father's efforts to publish gripping and sometimes shocking news stories. Bennett contacted Henry Stanley, an explorer, and he urged him to find David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary who had traveled to Africa a few years earlier and hadn't really been seen. Bennett bankrolled Stanley and published his letters from Africa. So periodically he'd send another letter saying, this is where I've arrived, I can come to these, waterfalls or whatever. Finally, in 1871, after 2 years of pursuit, Stanley found Livingstone in Central Africa, and we all know what he asked him, right? Dr. Livingstone, I presume, right? So this was great publicity for the newspaper, right? I mean, think of all these people buying the Herald and waiting to find out, is he gonna meet him or not? So that's Henry Stanley. And here's David Livingstone. Well, while not at the office, Bennett was busy playing sports. He was a skilled horse rider, polo player, tennis player, and sailor. He won a transatlantic sailing competition, taking his boat from New Jersey to England. So he was supposed to have been just a fabulous sailor. Because of his sailing skills, the New York Yacht Club made him their commodore when he was only 30 years old. Well, in 1875, Bennett and Grace's paths would cross for the first time. Bennett heard news from Newport that he wanted to publicize in his newspaper, the Herald. In December 1875, 12-year-old Geneva Defray died after having taken a fall. Her father, Manuel, was a Portuguese immigrant gardener. He's from the Azores, and her mother, Anna, was an Irish immigrant. The Defrays claimed that Father Grace refused to provide a Catholic burial for Geneva, and they believed that he was punishing them because they had sent her to public school rather than to St. Mary's School. Grace claimed that they hadn't reached out in time to call a priest and had to have last rites administered, and they waited till she died, and he was upset about that. The Newport and Providence papers covered the matter very closely. A reporter from the Providence Journal even went to see Bishop Hendricken to have a meeting and question him about it. Well, when Bennett heard about the case, he was outraged by Grace's actions. Bennett was nominally Catholic, but was alienated from the Catholic Church. So he was happy to embarrass the Catholic Church through a series of hostile articles in the New York Herald. The stories were headlined "Priestly Intolerance," "Father Grace's Intolerance," day after day after day. Now, I don't know if, can people see that far, or is that just a tiny blur? Father Grace's Intolerance, the priest flatly charged with untruth, Bishop Hendricken appealed to. So this is really I think it's the largest circulating newspaper in its time, the New York Herald. So this is very bad press for Father Grace. Soon the New York Times picked it up, and Boston papers were running stories on it, referring to it as the Newport burial scandal. Papers in St. Louis and other parts of the Midwest picked up the topic, so it really became a national story. Eventually, an awkward compromise was reached. Bishop Hendricken told Mr. Defray that his daughter could have a Catholic burial, and he published the letter in the Providence Journal so that the whole community would know. So he wrote the letter privately and then published it in the journal. Geneva's casket was taken out of the cemetery It was in a vault, so the casket hadn't been buried. It was brought back to St. Mary's, where Grace's assistant, Father Thomas Clinton, presided over a brief Catholic burial service, and then her casket was returned to the graveyard. 2,000 people were reported to be outside of St. Mary's watching the proceedings. Notice Father Grace wasn't there. I think he recognized that probably wouldn't have been a good one to go to. While the controversy was settled, the Defray affair tarnished Grace's reputation with many in the Newport community, especially among non-Catholics. Both the Newport Daily News and the Newport Mercury criticized him, but not as harshly as Bennett had. It seems that the controversy probably took a physical and emotional toll on Grace as well. As the conflict was unfolding, Grace complained of feeling ill and asked the St. Mary's parishioners to pray for him. While Grace was struggling, Bennett in 1876 seemed to be flourishing. Age 35, he decided it was time to settle down. So he got engaged to Caroline May, a young socialite from Maryland. Bennett, who was famous for his drinking and carousing, was settling down. In the summer of 1876, he brought the May family to Newport to stay with him at his rented villa. The wedding would be held in January 1877. In the summer of 1876, he also brought polo to Newport. I guess there's some debate about where polo started, but we think Morton Park. I think that's where we think he played the first polo match. Well, New Year's Day was a holiday traditionally associated with alcohol. Now, I think of New Year's Eve now being associated with heavy drinking, but this was New Year's Day. It was associated with heavy drinking. People were ringing in the new year and warming themselves up with some beverage, right? Well, Bennett was invited to the New York City mansion of the May family on New Year's Day, 1877, just before the wedding. Maybe this is 2 days before the wedding. Bennett had been drinking heavily before he arrived at the party and continued to drink at the May house. He became so intoxicated that he lost his bearings entirely and started urinating in the fireplace. That's not good. He was then quickly ushered out of the party and taken home. A couple of days later, he woke up, literally, I think he slept for days, and recovered enough to go to one of his clubs. As he made no effort to contact or apologize to his fiancée and her family for his behavior, Caroline called off the wedding. And her brother, Fred, waited for Bennett outside the club. As soon as Bennett stepped outside, May thrashed him with a whip, and Bennett was taken bruised and bleeding back to his home. In the aftermath, Bennett thought about a proper response. Now, my idea would have been maybe an apology. It's just me, I don't know. But he said, no, as a gentleman who's been insulted, the proper response would be a duel. Yeah, no, yeah, apologies. Goodness. So it was time for a duel. So they each got a second, went to some, hidden away spot, and neither fired anywhere near the other. And it seems like they weren't trying, so they just wanted to do the ritual of shooting, and so that was over. But Bennett had a bad week, I'd say. So he decided after the duel to move back to France. And now he's going to continue to run this newspaper from Paris and would occasionally return to New York and Newport. Well, one event that soon brought him back to the United States was the wedding of his sister, Jeanette. So I should have said that they're just the two siblings. So he's older by 10 years or so. Well, as Jeanette was a young heiress in her early 20s, her actions were closely followed by the press. In the beginning of 1878, papers anxiously reported that she might be marrying a Scottish aristocrat. Then in the summer of 1878, the New York Times reported that no, she was marrying an American named Isaac Bell Jr., and that they would have a grand wedding in New York City. Here he is, Isaac Bell Jr. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find a decent picture of Jeanette, so if that's not her wedding picture, I don't know, but my wife was saying, you have to show a picture of the bride. I was like, that's all I've got. So anyway, just try to imagine what Jeanette looked like 30 years younger. Well, so she's going to marry Isaac Bell Jr., and it's going to be a grand wedding in New York City. The New York Times said this promised to be one of the great social events of the season. In September, a Boston paper reported that no, the wedding would actually be in Newport. and that the Archbishop of New York City, John McCloskey, would officiate because he would be on vacation in Newport at that time. As Bell was an Episcopalian, the wedding would not be in a church, but in a home, as mixed marriages were not held in Catholic churches at this time. In this case, Fairlawn was chosen, as this was where James Gordon Bennett was staying. He was a friend of the owner, whose name was Levi Morton. How about that? Anybody on that? Does that look familiar? Salve's Pell Center? Okay. And I don't know if anybody's in Circle of Scholars, you've probably been in there. A reporter for the Fall River paper covering the event wondered whether in the history of Newport there had ever been a wedding that created as much interest as this one. The mansion was decorated lavishly with flowers, and Jeanette walked in on the arm of her brother, as her father had died a few years earlier. So there's this, and if you think, those of you who are familiar with it, there's a ballroom in back, right? So this is the ballroom. So they're walking down the aisle of the ballroom. Waiting for them in the front of the ballroom was Isaac Bell, the groom, but not the Archbishop. Filling in was Dr. Grace. The Archbishop's plans had changed. Before the ceremony began, Grace gave his listeners a short but very stern address on the sanctity of marriage, reminding them that what God had joined together, no man must rend asunder. A message that had to be intended for James Gordon Bennett as much as the bride and groom, I think. Well, money didn't seem to be a concern for the Bells. For one thing, the newspapers reported that they received over $100,000 in wedding gifts. So that could kind of tide you over, right? Getting started. Isaac had retired at 31 from his work as a cotton broker shortly before his marriage. He'd already retired, right, at 31. And Jeanette had inherited considerable money from the father, right? So for their Newport home, Jeanette's brother gave them land on Bellevue Avenue, and they hired this new firm called McKim, Mead, and White to design a shingle-style home for them. That looks familiar, right? By this time, Bennett had purchased Stone Villa, and I didn't have a picture of that, but Stone Villa was where the CVS is, on the Bellevue Gardens, I think it's called, the Almax, if anyone remembers Almax from a million years ago. The following summer, James Gordon Bennett came back to visit Newport again. So this would be 1879. This time with his polo-playing friend, Captain Henry Candy. Probably under the influence of alcohol, Bennett dared his friend, who he called Sugar Candy, to ride his horse up the steps of the reading room, right, and into the porch. So there's Captain Sugar Candy. I think Captain Candy had some drinks too. So he obliged, and the reading room directors let them know that they were not amused by that stunt and that he was no longer welcome. Now, some historians have argued that Bennett was so annoyed that he decided to build his own club right across the street from Stone Villa. I don't know the answer to that. Rockwell Stensrud, who wrote a history for the Redwood Library, History of Newport, he said that it was already in the works that to build the casino. In any case, the new club, beautiful new club, again, it was the McKim, Mead, and White, same firm that's going to build the Isaac Bell House, grass tennis courts that are going to house the US Open for many years, a theater, a restaurant, hotel rooms. Cost him $100,000 to construct, which I can't believe he got all that done for that amount of money. Well, as the club was going up in 1880, Bennett put up another $100,000 to help Ireland. This was known as the Herald Fund. Western Ireland's farmers had been struggling for a couple of years, and many observers feared that a second potato famine was about to hit County Mayo and other parts of Western Ireland. They were having food crop failures, food shortages. And this is sometimes referred to in Irish history as the second famine or Ireland's mini famine. Well, Bennett's mother, Henrietta, remember, was born in Ireland. So that may have made him particularly sensitive to the crisis. While eager to help the Irish, Bennett was going to do it on his own terms. The leading Irish political figure of the day was Charles Stewart Parnell. He was coming to America in 1880 to raise money for the suffering farmers, but Bennett didn't like Parnell, didn't like his politics, so he was not going to contribute to Parnell's fund. He was afraid some of the money was going to go to Parnell. So there's Charles Stewart Parnell looking kind of Napoleonic there at that pose. And then this poster, I don't know if people can see that, but they call it the land war. Some real tensions about paying rents, what kind of rents were fair. Parnell was telling the farmers, pay what you think is fair. And you imagine the landlords were not liking that at all. Well, Dr. Grace was a supporter of Parnell, and he helped raise funds for Parnell's two organizations, the Land League and the Ladies' Land League. However, Grace didn't do anything to undermine Bennett's fundraising efforts. Some of his St. Mary's parishioners contributed to Bennett's fund, which ultimately raised $325,000 in support of Ireland's farmers, while Parnell raised another $300,000. So this is quite a block of money. While Bennett was no doubt basking in all the attention he was getting about his beautiful new club and his generosity towards the Irish farmers, Grace was struggling. In March 1880, he suffered a stroke, only 41 years old. John Lafarge, again the son, remembered seeing Grace when he was a boy after the stroke, and he recalled that Grace had to pick up one arm with the other one, right? So he had obviously, had some paralysis. Lafarge also said that the stroke left Grace's face somewhat affected as well. And doing this research, I just wonder if all the stress over the Defray case might have contributed to Grace's health problems, because to suffer a stroke at that young age, but who knows? Well, Grace was not about to slow down, or certainly not about to retire. He continued to raise money to pay off the church's debts and make improvements in the church. And he also enlisted a prominent architect, Dudley Newton, to design a new convent for the Sisters of Mercy, who'd been living in cramped quarters. That's the Mercy Convent, right? Does that ring a bell? Now, if anybody's confused, that's on Thames Street, but that was originally right next to the church, but it was moved in the 1980s and became a B&B. In 1881, Grace canvassed the whole parish, stopping at the home of every registered parishioner, asking for funds to pay off the church's remaining debts. He raised $12,000. A dedicated walker, Grace would set out at the same time every day. After his stroke, he could no longer operate an umbrella. He just couldn't lift it, right, with the one arm. But that didn't deter him. He would walk, rain or shine, no umbrella. So if it rained, he got wet, but he'd still walk at whatever, hour he always walked. I have to thank Father Bob Heyman. He found that reference. By 1883, some of the St. Mary's parishioners thought that running a parish with more than 6,000 members was too much for Grace. So that's how big St. Mary's was in 1883, over 6,000. They worried that he would suffer more health problems if he had to continue. A group led by Dr. Horatio Storer, a retired Harvard Medical School professor, went to see the bishop, Bishop Hendricken, to discuss the matter. While Grace wasn't happy about it, the bishop decided that a new parish would be split off from St. Mary's on the north side of town, which would now include a heavily Irish neighborhood called Kerry Hill. The new parish, called St. Joseph's, which gets confusing, right? Because we had a St. Joseph's on Barney Street, so they might have thought of another name, but oh well. It would have 1,500 members and would be led by another young Irish priest, Father James Coyle. Oh, here's Horatio Storer, Dr. Storer. And then here's Father James Coyle. Coyle had no building for the church, so he decided to buy an existing Protestant church. Zion Episcopal on Washington Square was struggling financially, so they wanted to sell their building. Coyle and the trustees purchased it, and the Zion congregation moved uptown to Rhode Island Avenue and renamed themselves St. George's, again, just to confuse us. So St. Joseph's, Washington Square, and that's the rectory that Coyle built. Everybody know that? Okay, you guys are hard to stump here. Now a movie theater and a bed and breakfast or something next door? The new St. Joseph's Church, and then this other place. So Zion Episcopal moves uptown, and that becomes St. George's, and that's right next to Newport Hospital. If you were to park in the parking lot, you'd be backing up to the back of it. It eventually shut down just about 10 years ago. Now it's kind of like an evangelical Christian church called Crosspoint. So it's still functioning, but it's not an Episcopal church anymore. But that's the old Zion Episcopal. Okay. The new St. Joseph's Church flourished under Coyle, and one of his most generous supporters was Jeanette Bennett Bell, whose Bellevue Avenue house would have put her in St. Mary's. So I think she preferred to be at St. Joe's. Now, with a smaller congregation and a debt-free parish, Grace could focus on making significant improvements to St. Mary's. He'd already installed ceramic tiles from Spain over the cement floor. So they're still there in St. Mary's, those Spanish tiles. By the 1890s, he was importing stained glass windows from Austria. So he's the one who put stained glass windows in the church. He also contacted the original architect, Patrick Keeley, put him to work one more time, and he had him design what I think are called ceiling vaults, but these are wooden beams, kind of decorative beams just below the ceiling. I don't know if that. He also remodeled the school, so he was very busy. Well, Grace's parishioners were very attached to him, and as the years went by, they made several efforts to express their appreciation. In 1894, they raised funds to send Dr. Grace, his brother Thomas, also a priest, and his sister, Mary Denniston, to sail to Europe and visit Ireland and Italy. When they returned 3 months later to Newport, a large contingent of St. Mary's parishioners, along with the Newport band, was waiting at the wharf to serenade him and escort him back to the parish. In 1898, they sent him back to Ireland once more. Shortly after arriving in New York City, however, Grace took a fall, and he never recovered, dying in September 1898 at the age of 60. When news of Dr. Grace's death was reported, the editor of the Providence Journal predicted that the funeral would be like nothing ever seen before in the diocese. And he was right. The Bishop of Providence, who now is Matthew Harkins, after Hendricken, he presided and was assisted by 2 other bishops and 97 priests. And they list all the priests' names. After the service, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Knights of Columbus, the Temperance Societies led the procession, which slowly wound its way across town over to Warner Street to St. Mary's Cemetery. The Boston Globe covered it and said the funeral was one of the most memorable events in the history of Newport, the city witnessing a great outpouring of people of all classes and creeds. Following the funeral, the Newport Mercury's editor declared that Grace was deeply imbued in the hearts of the residents of the city. Rich, poor, high, and lowly learned to love him with equal love and trustfulness. His tender care and touching sympathy for those ailing in mind or body showed the great heart that beat beneath a somewhat austere exterior. So they noted he was kind of a stern figure, but, thought he had a heart of gold underneath it all. Bennett, who was in Paris, heard of Grace's death and decided to pay tribute to him as well in the New York Herald. He ran an obituary noting that Grace had died of brain trouble, and he added that Grace was much beloved by the cottagers and was known and honored by the Pope. So it was a very nice kind of tribute to him in the New York Herald. So I feel like they finally kind of reconcile here at the end. In the years following, Bennett lived mostly in France. Oh, I want to show you the Dr. Grace's headstone. If you go to St. Mary's Cemetery, this beautiful headstone. It's really probably one of the most prominent in the St. Mary's Cemetery. Now, nobody's going to be able to read that writing, right? Heart of Jesus, burning with love for us, have mercy on the soul of Philip Grace, D.D., who departed this life Friday, September 23rd, fortified with the sacraments in the 61st year of his age, the 37th of his priesthood, and the 30th of his pastorate in the Church of Our Lady of the Isle, Newport. Well, in the years following, Bennett lived mostly in France, splitting his time between his apartment in Paris, his country estate at Versailles, and his beach house in Nice. Nice to have options, right? Versailles gets old, you get tired of it. So in 1914, the always unpredictable Bennett took a surprising step. He decided to get married. At 73, he'd be settling down. He married Maud Potter, the widow of the head of the Reuters news service. Although baptized a Catholic, Bennett married Potter in an Episcopalian ceremony at the American Church in Paris, and he was received into the Episcopal Church at the time of the wedding. Bennett lived 4 more years, dying in 1918, and was buried in Paris. I think by this time he really saw himself as a Frenchman, right? So here's Bennett in later life. And then this is a very curious thing. There's actually a street named Gordon Bennett in Paris, 16th arrondissement. Well, to conclude, I think studying these colorful characters gives us insights into the Irish experience during Newport's Gilded Age, and that in turn hopefully gives us a fuller picture of Newport as a whole during this era. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Quinn? Oh, wait a minute. Yes.
Scott, this way.
You think I need that? John, at that time in Newport history, I know the source material is somewhat limited to the well-to-do or the influential. But how big, can you make a guess, how big was the Irish working class at that time? I know there's not a lot of biographical sketches of, say, an ordinary laborer, but were there a lot of people, and can you give a little generalization of what their life might have been like?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a good point, because there are some Irish who are doing very well, and some who are middle class, but most people would have been in the working class. But what I think what's interesting about Newport is you don't have the mills, and so you really have a different setup. So the poorer Newporters are catering to the mansions, right? So those are the servants who are working in the mansions, or people who are the gardeners, or there's all kinds of ways which you could be kind of supporting and I guess some working in hotels too, but that was kind of the way that they were getting by. And that would be a good number of people. And I make this argument in the book that I think maybe there was less tension in Newport between working class people and the people who owned the mansions, as opposed to towns like Fall River, where people are working in the mills. And I'm not quite sure why, but it does seem like the towns like Worcester that had more industry tended to have more tension between the Irish working class and the upper class. So I don't know if it was just that the people had to live with each other in closer proximity. You're actually living in Mrs. Vanderbilt's house, and she's actually got to talk to, Bridget O'Hara every day. I don't know if that made a difference, but it does seem like there was more harmony between the working class and the upper class here than there was in, say, Providence or Worcester or some of these cities that were more industrial. But as you said, there's teasing that out. It's not like there's a lot of diaries or something like that but that's my sense on it.
Thank you. You mentioned early on about the priest that went over to Europe, and he went to Ireland to try and recruit some nuns and priests. And then he went to Europe to get money. And then on the way back, the boat disappeared.
Right.
Did the money disappear?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the letters that exist, it sounds like money had been promised, but I don't think he had any of it on him, though. Because it was this group called the Propagation for the Faith that he had met with, and they had promised. So I assume they were going to send the money in the future, because he had this sort of optimistic letter that he wrote shortly before getting on the boat. But I don't think he had anything with him. So interesting.
Dr. Quinn, where did the Harpers make their money?
How did they?
Harpers.
The Harpers?
Right.
Yeah. So the Carroll family were big landowners in Maryland. It's amazing how much acreage they had. So I guess agriculture, I guess. I went to a conference a few years ago in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and there was a big sign on the campus saying this had all been the Carroll estate. I mean, so it's amazing. I mean, you even think like towns like Carrollton, right? There's a town, New Carrollton, so they just had vast amounts of land in Maryland. but it would be interesting to trace that out, because I mean that's really unusual for the Irish who came over, right? So I mean they must have had a lot of resources in Ireland and got to Maryland early, but I'd say yeah, it's through agriculture that they had their fortune.
Mike.
Oh, Mike.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Sure.
That was great. When you mentioned 1900, St. Mary's Church, the Irish population reached 6,000. I'm totally in line there. And then my knowledge does not equate to yours at all. You're far more knowledgeable. But I always say that when it reached 6,000, they necessitated the building of St. Augustine's, and you inserted several steps in between there. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so St. Mary's has to be subdivided a second time. So you had about 6,000, and then 1,500 or so are cut off for St. Joe's. So on the north side, so then on the other side, you're cutting St. Augustine's, and that would be 1911. So just 12 years, well, I guess, so what would that be, 1885 to 19, so it'd be like a 25-year period. St. Mary's had grown up again to had made up for the loss of St. Joseph. So now it was again 6,000 or so.
Yeah.
So it's
thank you very much. That was enlightening to me, really.
Good.
Thanks.
Glad to hear it.
Perhaps someone on this side have a question?
Sean, do you want to explain about the name Gordon Bennett? So one of my colleague here from Salve. Ann's got a.
Yeah, hi. So when I heard that John was speaking about Gordon Bennett, we lived in England for many years, and Gordon Bennett is like an expression of surprise there. So if something happens, like if you fall over or if you forget something, you say, Gordon Bennett. So it seems to be that it's taken from this Gordon Bennett, because I just Googled it, I mean, so I've got no great evidence for it, but it appears to be that he's the person who originated it.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. This is odd. But please don't forget about John's book in the back. He will be signing them if you would like that. And also there are some cheese and crackers, but thank you so much for coming. If you have any other questions or information, please just check out our website at newportirishhistory@gmail. Oh, no, newportirishhistory.org, but then you can just email us at newportirishhistory@gmail.com. All right, and thank you very, very much, and I'll see you.